If we then are okay hiring what we believe is the best and most skilled, and that entity happens to then have a majority, if not only, white workforce, are we saying
Yeah.
we're proud to have that company then represent this country?
You cannot interfere, and that's all I'm saying. You cannot interfere in the choice of a businessman to appoint who he wants. You cannot do it, never. Because what...
Guys, so this is one of those videos in 2025 that all South Africans need to watch. President Ramaphosa, or probably the GNU government, has just actually enacted fully this Employment Equity Amendment Act, all right? And it speaks about how, certain regulations have been stipulated to affect businesses in South Africa that actually have employees less than 50 people. Now, businesses above 50 people will now be demanded to follow some regulations that, might affect the way in which business, especially business people in South Africa, conduct business. And this interview actually really, strikes me in many ways. It's a really interesting interview. I remember I told you 2025 is going to be a really intelligent year. We're going to be doing intelligent analysis to really understand where and why South Africa has come to where it is. And so there's this National Employment Associations, National Employment Association of South Africa, the chief executive, his name is Gerhard Papenfoss, all right, in a really fierce, I think this is a really fierce interview because you see both him and this journalist actually have really antagonistic, ways in which they see the same problem. And that's the fact that while the chief executive of this NEASA, National Employment Association of Africa, sees the problem in that this new law for business would demand the same kind of like BEE kind of treatment, where probably one person would have to, one business person has to consider who he employs or gives a job because of their skin color or some other, parameters. This journalist here is actually trying to also see the problem in the light that this new law might be able to help reduce the inequality that South Africa has actually inherited from its colonial times till present, all right? And so it's a really interesting interview. I really admonish that you all watch till the end, to really understand, this is kind of like what I'm beginning to see that's spelling out the future of South Africa, where South Africa is going in terms of business. And it's really important. Let's quickly take a watch quickly, and I'll be back for that analysis.
Now, the much-anticipated Employment Equity Amendment Act officially came into effect yesterday, marking a significant shift in South Africa's labor landscape. Signed into law by President Cyril Ramaphosa in April last year, or rather 2023, the act aims to streamline regulatory processes for small businesses while promoting equitable workplace practices. But what does compliance with the new legislation actually entail for employers? Let's unpack it. Gerhard Papenfoss is the chief executive of the National Employers Association of South Africa. Gerhard, thank you so much for the time. Has this decision gone down well with the National Employers Association?
No, it doesn't, Arabile. We are of the view that any interference in the workplace choke business. It is, when a businessman starts off conducting his own business, when an entrepreneur begins his own thing, doing his own thing, then the idea is that you conduct your business in the way you want. That's the whole idea. There has to be the freedom of a businessman to conduct his business in the way he wants and to employ the people that he wants.
But Gerhard.
Now, what this piece of legislation intends eventually, because the regulations isn't published yet, is that government will expect of a business to conduct this business on a spreadsheet. In other words, you must appoint a certain number of certain people in terms of color and gender. And now that is simply impossible. And it's not as if business don't want to do this. It is impossible to do this. And now there will be penalties, and there will be definitely, well, there will be penalties, and these penalties awaiting you if you don't do this in terms of this new legislation. So this will stifle business. It will place South Africa in terms of employment in an even worse position.
Hold on, Gerard, let me get this right though. If I'm correct, for small businesses with fewer than 50 employees, they are no longer classified as designated employers, which means they are exempt from creating employment equity plans and submitting EE reports to the Department of Employment and Labor. One would think that that removes the regulatory burden, though, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, it does. It does. But that confirms the point. The minister has admitted that this will stifle business. And therefore, they've exempted SMMEs, in other words, people employing less than 50. But if that is the case for businesses employing less than 50, of course, then it applies to business employing more than 50. You cannot, if two people sit in front of you applying for a job, you cannot make the final decision on who needs to work for you on the basis of the color of a person's skin. That is impossible. Can you imagine you employ somebody and you say to him, listen, I wanted to appoint A, but since that person's skin color didn't suit me, I'm appointing you. You're the second best, but I'm appointing you. We cannot do that. And, this is not a race-focused issue. It is simply that you cannot conduct your business on a spreadsheet. So many men, so many women.
Gerard, I'm going to give you...
and that color, you cannot do that.
Gerard, I'm going to give you a chance to keep going on this one, but I'm still trying to understand you a little bit better here. One, the amendment itself says if you have less than 50, you don't have to necessarily comply with employment equity and put in those reports, right? Absolutely. If you have more than 50, ultimately you then do need to comply. All of this is aimed at readdressing or addressing the issues of the past, but also trying to create employment in any best way. So in that 50, for the lower, smaller businesses with fewer than 50 employees, their only worry at that point is to just hire who's best. Once you go over 50, that's where the need then comes for you to think of greater diversity. Is that not helpful to this entire situation?
It is, in our current environment in South Africa, skills are needed. We've got a skills shortage in South Africa. So any business will be forced in terms of the requirement for good people to appoint, and in that way, diversity will be increased. But the point is, you cannot put a target on that. It is simply impractical in various respects. You cannot put a target. You must leave it for the businessman. Now, if a businessman says, listen, I want to conduct my business and I want to appoint for that business a particular group of people, and I find my skills in a certain group of people, we have to leave him alone that you do that. Because what government doesn't realize is that culture plays an enormous role in business. Culture. Now, if there's a certain group in South Africa, and I'm not going to mention groups now because you can go on and on with that. And it's not only white or a particular group. I'm talking about many groups. A guy says, I want this type of people in my workplace. I get along with them for perhaps even religious reasons. They suit my style of doing business. You cannot interfere with that, because all he will do, he will say, well, in that case, I will no longer employ people, or I will limit my business to under 50.
Are we not limiting ourselves here then, Gerard? Are we not actually being almost closed off and closed-minded to many aspects here? Because one, you spoke about the skills shortage. If we then go on and actually look at trying to enhance that skills shortage, this act looks, or this amendment, I would think, is looking to actually do that a little bit more. Two, you speak about culture. Well, the culture of a business can change for better or for worse, and it doesn't matter who you hire. If you're doing it on the basis of growing and enhancing skill, should that not be your first priority? And this amendment looks to me, I may be wrong, but looks to me like it's saying to you, worry about employment, which means that you're getting greater skill. And once you go over a certain limit or you want to contract yourself to government, you then need to consider diversity. I would think that the less than 50s are looking at this saying, I can get the best possible people now and don't have to worry about restraints. So already that businessman is hiring as he wants.
Well, that is, I actually agree with you 100%. Any wise business and any wise businessman and women, of course, will, in appointing people, appoint the best skills available. And in making that decision, there's a lot of issues, subjective issues and objective issues that you take into consideration. What I'm opposed to is that government puts a quota in this. And this is, they call it targets. It's nothing other than a quota. We say, leave that to business. It is, if a businessman wants to conduct a business which in your view is, listen, this is not good for your business, well, that is his choice. And he will find out sooner than later that, listen, I've made mistakes here and I've got to change. But that change happens in a business based on an experience of a business, but you cannot, from the side of a government, impose quotas on a business. That is what we say. If there's somebody, two people sit in front of me today, and I repeat that, I will appoint the best, regardless of the color of that person. Okay. But if you say, regardless of the color of that person, because I cannot afford to appoint the second best.
Okay, fair enough.
In determining who is that best person, I take all kinds of criteria into consideration, but the final decision rests with me as the businessman because I pay and I take the risk. Government, sorry, I don't want to elaborate on this too long. Cannot come in and say, listen, if the relationship between you and an employee goes wrong, that person can take you to the CCMA. Dismissing a person is extremely difficult. But you know what? We tell you whom to employ. No, I take the responsibility of who to employ, and I take the risk when things go wrong.
I take on your point. Let me ask you this then. Yes. How do we then address the skills shortage in South Africa if businesses are not willing to play their own role?
Well, first of all, the skills shortage starts with the addressing of the skills shortage starts with education. That is where we start. We need to really jack up South Africa's education system because it is one of the worst education systems in the whole world. And I can rightfully say one of the world. Government has seriously neglected this over the past year. So that's where you started. Secondly, then you must give people an opportunity, but you cannot force people on the basis of color to enhance a particular group. You cannot do that because inherent in a businessman is resistant to that. And I say, leave it to business. You know, I in the IASAs, we have as our members thousands of businesses, and we have, and I want to use this as an example. We have a youth development program. And 99% of the people benefiting through that program are black people, black young people, educated, matrics, TVET colleges, qualified, and graduates. 99% of the people that benefit through that are black people. And our businesses stand in queues to utilize that benefit.
Yeah,
we make these things available. So what I'm saying, there's not a resistance to the color thing. It is a resistance to government interfering in your business. So will we, if you say, unless government say we will not appoint people of a certain skin of color, color of skin, we want to appoint them. I said, no, you'll be forced to, because there are skill shortages and always appoint the best. So what am I against?
So Gerard,
a quota that dictate to me when and how I must employ.
So Gerard, we know that the skill shortage in South Africa is misaligned completely, right?
Yeah.
With a larger majority of people of color having the problem of a skill shortage greater than those
Yeah.
white or otherwise.
Yeah.
If we then are okay hiring what we believe is the best and most skilled, and that entity happens to then have a majority, if not only, white workforce, are we saying
Yeah.
we're proud to have that company then represent this country when the majority of this country then is being left behind because that company is not willing to enhance the skills of the others?
But you cannot interfere, and that's all I'm saying. You cannot interfere in the choice of a businessman to appoint who he wants. You cannot do it, never. Because what will happen if you do that? That business will simply not employ. So whether we like it or not, you cannot interfere. The
All right.
inherent, what made a businessman is the right to conduct his business in the way he likes. The moment you interfere, and you can give all kinds of reasons, he says, but I'm not going to do that. This is how I want to conduct my business. This is how I want to conduct my business. We can look at that business from the outside and say, but you're not wise. He said, well, that's still my choice.
Yeah. All right. Gerard, I appreciate the time. I think it's a very robust conversation that is absolutely needed. But, man, I think there are various elements of this that may be ignored, that may not necessarily be put together. In our fledgling democracy, we need to find the right methods to grow this country holistically for either end of the spectrum here. So I think that definitely matters. I hope we can do this again, but I really appreciate it.
Brilliant, guys. So I don't know what you guys think, but I think this interview actually, for me, struck me in many, many ways. First of all, it takes me back to the Bantu Education Act of 1953. I actually just completed an interview with a former statistician general. I think that's the way it's called in South Africa. And he spoke about the reasons why the blacks and the coloreds in South Africa, right, are actually really sort of like below in performance and in many issues in South Africa, less than the Indians and the whites, all right? And he really gives a really brilliant analysis of the problem on why, it appears that BEE is creating a lot of violence among the black community in South Africa. BEE is sort of like increasing the violence in South Africa, so to speak, and it's actually making black people poorer. Meanwhile, it's supposed to make sort of like reduce these inequalities we speak about in South Africa. His name is actually Statistician General Dr. Paddy Lekgotla, all right? And he really analyzes some really interesting facts for me that actually in 1953, that was when South Africa started seeing, I'll be making a real series of videos on this and if possible, documentaries to really help us understand how the whites and the Indians sort of like left the blacks and the coloreds in South Africa behind in terms of development, in terms of education, in terms of skills development and all of this, you see. And for me as a Nigerian, and also a black person, I identify as a black African especially. It's really interesting for me because it teaches us and tells us how history has to really be understood if we have to solve the problems of the present today, all right? So he speaks about how, BEE has made inequality in South Africa worse. BEE was actually a way to really, allow this whole inequality in South Africa, especially the racial divides, reduced. But he's arguing as a black person that BEE has actually made inequality worse. He actually argues that BEE is among one of these reasons that actually makes the fact that peace cannot be achieved in South Africa, because if you have a really angry majority, you understand, and it actually affects even the whites, the Indians, the well-to-do in South Africa, except probably the white businessmen or the business people in South Africa would have to probably stay behind the whole Cape Independence movement, and one day maybe the Cape Independence thing takes off and then we see a secessionist movement in South Africa, which would spell the doom of the entire South Africa, because I really don't know if probably the Cape Independence whatever it is, would actually be identified or recognized at the level of the United Nations, and it's just going to create a whole a mess totally, just like we saw in Rhodesia and in Zimbabwe. Okay, so it's really important that every South African, white, Indian, colored, black, put heads together to really come to really practical, robust discussions on how to really solve this whole problem with skills shortage, skills development, and the racial divide in terms of the development among the groups. All right. So now this interview here really now spelled out a lot of the issues. I think that it will really be important to really, but before we begin, I think it's important to really understand what really is this act that the ANC just signed. It actually says the law has actually been around since April 2023, but for some reason it has been fully enacted by January 2025. Okay, so what is this act here? I actually found on the website of South Africa's government, the official South African government website, www.gov.za. All right, it says Minister Nomakosazana Meth announces Employment Equity Amendment Act, which will come into effect on January the 1st, 2020. So it's actually in effect as we speak. Okay. It says that the Minister of Department and Employment, the Minister of Department of Labor, Employment and Labor, Ms. Nomakosazana Meth, is pleased to announce that the Employment Equity Amendment Act, aimed at reducing the regulatory burden for employers to allow them to focus on job creation, will come into effect on January the 1st, 2025. It says that President Ramaphosa signed the proclamation notice giving effect to start date, to the start date of implementation of the Employment Equity Amendment Act number 4 and of 2022. So this is actually an act that was already designed in 2022, but I think it's now fully rolled out in 2025. It says that in terms of the notice gazetted on 28 November 2024, small businesses, this is the key, small businesses that employ less than 50 employees are no longer bound to comply to Chapter 3 of the Employment Equity Act 1998. For example, in relation to the submission of the EE report starting from 2025 EE reporting period, all right, it says that the latest amendments draw their genesis in 2019 when the Department and Commission for Employment Equity initiated sector engagements with the intention of setting a sector EE target to give workplace transformation impetus. All right. Now, the main objectives of the Employment Equity Amendments legislation is as follows. 1, to reduce the regulatory burden for small employers. All right. Employers employing between 1 to 49 employees will be excluded from complying with the provisions of Chapter 3 of the EE Act. 2, it wants to empower the minister to regulate the sector-specific numerical EE target. So in other words, the minister now would be able to, just like as we saw in this interview, where the chief executive of the National Employment Agency speaks about how you cannot make your business or put your business on an Excel sheet. In other words, this act gives the minister, it says that it wants to empower the minister to regulate the numerical targets. So there are numerical targets that actually would now be specified, if I read this policy correctly, for businesses above 50 employees. There are numerical targets that probably set the standard for how many people groups should be represented as employees in that business. All right. So this policy gives the minister, it says that it will empower the minister to regulate the sector specific numeric targets. All right. And now, those are actually the two major issues that I think the National Employment Agency, as we saw in this interview, is not really happy about. It also says that finally, this policy would strengthen the compliance, including the issuing of EE compliance certificates. All right. Minister Meth is positive that the regulatory flexibility, it will enable small businesses to now focus on growing their business and create jobs. All right. So that's the goal of this policy. It wants to help small businesses to really, grow businesses and then create jobs for small businesses less than 50. And now, the head of the national employment, as we saw in the interview, is not really happy about this because I don't know. There are many issues, and I think from his perspective, he sees this issue as a target. This is my reading now of his anger. He sees this issue as a target for businesses that are employ above 50 people. Now, let's try to understand this from the perspective of. Let's try to understand it from the perspective of big tech. Big tech, to understand from the business guys how they see this law, all right? Big tech is a website here, businesstech.co.za. It says big changes for South African companies with over 50 employees on the way. Now, let's understand what will be the effect of these policies for businesses that actually employ more than 50 people in South Africa. It says that South Africa's Employment Equity Amendment Act number 4 of 2022, EEAA, came into operation on the 1st of January 2025 with big changes for companies that employ over 50 people. It says the new laws were signed into law. The new laws were signed into law by President Cyril Ramaphosa in April 2023, but took some time to be implemented amid widespread backlash, just like the backlash against the Bella Act, the backlash against NHI, which probably might be rolled out soon, because the way I'm seeing this government, there are issues being rolled out, and really, it's really crazy. It now says that there's a director at Workman's Attorney, all right? His name is Kerry Fredericks. He said that the most noteworthy among the amendments allow the Minister of Employment and Labor to set numerical targets, what I said. So he said that this policy now would give power to the Minister of Employment and Labor to have and set numerical targets for 18 different sectors which have been identified by this minister. So the minister has identified 18 sectors in the economy of South Africa that they see necessary to have numerical targets, especially as regards the amount of employees or number of employees working in those industries, all right? So it says the amendment will introduce sectoral numerical targets to ensure that there is equitable representation. So it's almost like this whole DEI issue, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, to really allow for the bridging of the gap of the historical inadequacies of the historical trajectories and historical unfortunate incidences that actually occurred in South Africa's history. So it says that it wants to ensure that there's equitable representation of historically disadvantaged groups based on race, gender, and disability at all occupational levels in the workforce. Now, it says that once the laws are enforced, designated employers would need to comply with these sectoral targets. Although two separate and incredibly different draft regulations setting out the proposed sectoral targets have been published, the minister is yet to issue a final version of the regulations. And he says that because of now that what is now available is a draft, so to speak, there are lots of fears and concerns that are actually now brewing. And we could hear that from the chief executive of this employment, National South Africa's Employment Agency, so to speak, that, there are lots of fears in different sectors. What would this actually mean for us? Especially those who have employees above 50 people. Would it mean that some people will have to be fired so that some other people from different, it says that race, gender, and disability groups would have to come in to fill in those spaces? Would this create more unemployment in the system? What would this reshuffling look like? Okay, so these are kind of like the fears. But anyway, Fredericks actually says that, some other notable amendments which will come into effect as of January 2025 include: 1. Employers who employ less than 50 employees will no longer be considered to be designated employer. So in other words, in South Africa, there's a term called designated employers. And designated employers, it says that, they are actually employers who employed, more than 50 employees, but also those who employ less than 50 employees, as long as their annual turnover exceeded a specific threshold, which has been set out in the Schedule 4 of the EEA, they were all termed designated employers. So designated employer in South Africa, 1, employs more than 50 employees. 2, even if they employ less than 50 employees, if their turnover, is exceeds a certain threshold, they will be called designated employers. All right. Now, these designated employers, it says that those who employ less than 50 people will no longer be considered designated employers. So that's one plus for this law. And that's how this journalist in this video sees it, that, now that we might have companies who have less than 50 employees, and regardless of the fact that they make or they exceed above the turnover that has been stipulated by the law, this is kind of like a gain, because now they can keep on increasing their turnover without having to be subjected to the rules by those who employ more than 50 people. All right, that's how the journalist in the video sees it. But we can hear that the national chief executive of the national South African National Agency doesn't agree with that. Secondly, it says that this policy seems to have a different definition of people with disabilities. It says that the definition of people with disabilities has been extended to include people with intellectual so people with disabilities now has been extended to include people with intellectual or sensory impairments, which may limit their prospects of entry or advancement into employment. So previously, before, people with disabilities, remember, maybe they didn't have arms, they had poliomyelitis, and their legs weren't functioning properly, all the other forms of disabilities. But now, there are now disabilities that include intellectual impairment and, sensory impairment. These people now will now have to be included. They have to be included in that numerical requirement that is required for employers employing above 50 people. In other words, there has to be sort of like this kind of like inclusion of these disabilities and all that, so that there can actually be a bridging of the larger inequalities in South Africa. So this is actually part of the policies. And you could see that the business people in South Africa, represented by their chief executive, isn't really happy, because he argues that it's an intrusion, it's an infringement of the business risks that will be undertaken by the employer. All right, that's the businessman, because being business already is a lot of risk, and he thinks that this kinds of intrusion is actually just going to force many businesses to close down and maybe flee and take off from South Africa, which otherwise would then increase the unemployment in South Africa, unemployment rate, which is already at 33.3% thereabout today. So it's a really complex, complicated problem which this whole law would likely impact. But we don't know. We'll keep watching. So it says some of the other aspects of the law is the fact that there will now be psychometric testing of employees, or psychometric testing of employees or applicants for employment is no longer required to be certified by the Health Professional Council of South Africa or similar body for same to be permitted for use. So there used to be what they call psychometric testing of employees, all right? And let's just quickly check what that is so we can have a little bit of clarity. Psychometric testing. So in other words, it said that many employers use psychometric tests. They are actually, sort of like this numerical, verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, and all that. So the ANC, or probably now the GNU, wants to get rid of psychometric testing of employees, or applicants for employment is no longer required to be certified by the Health Professional Councils of South Africa. So previously, this psychometric test used to be certified by the Health Professional Council of South Africa. Now it's no longer required to be certified. Maybe some external body can certify them and then allow for maybe smoother recruitment, so to speak. So this is how the policy is being understood by the minister here. Then it says that EEA2 reports are no longer needed to be signed by the CEO of a designated employer, all right? And then finally, it says that, two more points. It says that in assessing a designated employer's compliance with its obligations, a designated employer's compliance with sectoral targets set by the minister may be taken into account. So in other words, it actually speaks that, these employers now have much more compliance, sort of like obligations to make sure that these new policies are put into place in their industries. And then finally, it says that Section 53 of the policy, which is not yet in effect, requires designated employers who intend to conclude agreements with an organ of the state for the furnishing of supplies or services they have to be in possession of a certificate confirming that they comply with their obligations in terms of the EEA. In other words, so if there's an employer that wishes to have what was the word now? The word was tender, so to speak. That they wish to work for the government in supplying needs or supplies or services. They have to comply. They have to have a certificate that shows that they comply with this numerical quota, so to speak, these obligations in the Employment Amendment Act to be able to assess those, tenders or probably the way they wish to work for the government at the time. And the law here says that that certificate may only be issued if the designated employer has complied with the sectoral targets, unless there's a reasonable justification for any failure to comply with such targets, all right? So in other words, this is actually more putting the gaze on the employer. So the employer doesn't have a freedom anymore in South Africa. There's now a lot of compliance obligations that employers and business people have to be subjected to be able to conduct their business effectively in South Africa. And so that's where South Africa is actually going in 2025 thereabout, and we'll really keep on understanding and watching how this whole thing plays out. But as we could hear from the CEO of the National Employment Agency, the National Employers Association of South Africa, you could see he's not happy. He actually argues or thinks that this is an infringement into the business, people's lives, so to speak, in South Africa, that they're already taking a lot of risk, in running a business in South Africa with the violence and all of that. There's a lot of risk already incurred. Now, for the government to be, intruding into their operations and all that, he actually thinks it's a threat and that, this is actually wrong, and they probably would protest, but I don't know how successful that protest would be, because it appears that this policy has actually already been enacted, so to speak. And so it's important now for South Africans to really start understanding the ramifications of this kind of policy, because at the end of the day, we know that the majority, I saw a quote really powerful yesterday. It spoke about South Africa is a country with a numerical majority, but an economic minority. In other words, the majority of South Africans who are actually blacks and maybe coloreds are high in number, but then economically they are a minority. So it speaks of how, the continuous marginalization of this large number might eventually slowly lead to a radicalization of that large majority. And we could see why the statistician general Lehotla, I'll be making a lot of videos on because he speaks a lot of sense that actually struck me. He speaks about how this is the reason why there cannot be peace in South Africa. South Africa is just not able to be peaceful because there's a majority that is being radicalized. There's a majority that is actually that suffering the effects or the impacts of an economic structural violence, so to speak, that is not really impacted by the whites or the Indians, probably, that are well-to-do, but it's kind of like a structural thing that was inherited during the days of apartheid, during the National Party. Especially, he speaks about how this stems from the 1953 Bantu Education Act and the 1961 Indian Education Act. So these kind of acts sort of like were stipulated to sort of like in a way allow for the whites and basically the whites anyway to maintain that Western style education, and this sort of, according to him, I'll be doing those videos, he speaks that this is where the whites and the Indians took off and left the blacks and the coloreds. And so this majority now, the ANC hasn't done much to really improve sort of like the education of this bulk. And what we see now is the majority of this majority ending up in SASSA, which is a social security system. And we know that SASSA, as a system of sustenance, isn't on the long run, in the context of South Africa, really beneficial, because what we're doing is that we are creating a much more dependency, poverty mindset, all right? We're not training these people to slowly start thinking in the way the whites think. Because why is it that when Julius Malema speaks about that business is white and government is black, why is business white? There's a certain kind of thinking that actually accompanies the mindset that would make one to start thinking in terms of production, all right, productivity. And I think this is where the whites, especially even in Europe generally, I'm a black person from Nigeria. Nigerians were actually also in a way sort of like capitalist trained. We didn't have the frivolity to have a socialist upbringing, so to speak, in the history of Nigeria. Nigeria has always sort of been a really capitalist free society where people are allowed to really think. If you really aspire for growth, growth and mindset and all that, it's available for you in Nigeria. But I think the likes of Ghana and maybe in South Africa now, we see a much more socialist twist, and it's really affecting the mindset of many of the people I'm beginning to really get to know in South Africa. And I think that what probably the government would need to do to really help this kind of situation is to now start having kind of like programs that really help to change this dependency mindset. SASA is good, all right, but it should be a short-term solution to helping the blacks and the coloreds, and even I think there are many whites who also receive SASA, but it speaks to the mindset, or there has to be a mindset shift that is needed to help the entire society, because even the whites in South Africa or the Indians who are well-to-do are also living in a risk, because there could be an implosion one day, and everything that's actually, that has actually been accumulated by these groups would actually just be blown into thin air. I saw a documentary also over the weekend where some white Afrikaner farmers, they had to auction their farming equipment and all that, and had to relocate for another life in the Congo, because the Congo government was actually giving grants to farmers to come and help them. So this kind of thing can actually affect even the well-to-do in South Africa. No one is actually afloat, so to speak. So it's something that is called for, that every people group have to bring their heads together, engage in a robust conversation on how to really help everyone rise. And in that way, we can see a much more flourishing side. And that's one of the reasons why I created Kwazemi here, to allow a platform for that kind of discussion to take root and begin that discussion, so that everybody can see where it is that they're lacking, where it is that they're really helping the violence, the economic structural violence in South Africa, and contribute to helping out. All right. And finally, I'll just wrap up this video with some thoughts on wealth and this whole thing about the need for mindset shift. It says that the way the wealthy people think is that, they think in such a way that wealth is the ability to solve the problems of other people other than yourself. All right. So what we see SASA doing is SASA is always making the majority of people who take SASA think in a way that, the wealthy man thinks, how can I help you? The poor man thinks, how can they help me? So this is what SASA is doing. SASA is making people start thinking or having a victimhood mentality where it's always I have to be helped. And if this kind of thing continues to perpetuate in a generational sequence, we might never see the end of poverty, especially among the majority in South Africa. All right. So it says that the wealthy, they are not rich because they have money, but the wealthy man is wealthy because he's rich. All right. You can give a poor man, you can give a SASA recipient tomorrow R1 million. If he is not rich, that R1 million in maybe give it 3-4 months, we could actually have that money disappear and he would be back to zero. All right. But give a rich person, rich in the mind, R1 million, and if that R1 million is taken away from him, it will come back because they are already rich. They don't need the R1 million to show that they are rich. And this is my problem with welfare, SASA, and all these kind of things. It actually is creating a dependency mindset. And in South Africa, since we have a really strange situation of a majority, probably 95% or 95% of blacks and coloreds, the majority, the numerical majority, but the economic minority, there needs to be a kind of mental shift that the ANC has to now slowly start training the people. All right. And the way to go, I don't know if it's effective to slowly start now taking from business. I know Julius Malema, EFF, MK, they speak about this whole monopoly capital and how capital has been monopolized among one people group. All right. I would agree with that. But now there also has to be a change in mentality. All right. The people who have been disenfranchised have to have educational programs or, training, so to speak, that help them to now start being productive in their mindset, in the way they think and all. And this is the role of government. That's why I think the ANC over these last 30 years hasn't really been impressive. And it speaks for itself. In the May 29 election, we saw how the people voted. They really didn't think that the ANC is actually capable of saving them. And now that we're even beginning to, from Prince Mashele, the analysis that, the ANC is slowly being crippled and, we see all the other parties trying to fight for the remnants of the ANC. The black majority, 90%, what happens to these guys? We see that it's easy to now get in and radicalize this group, and then we see a much more burnt South Africa where there's going to be problems and problems. And even the whites who are well-to-do would be in danger, all right? Except probably there will now be a secessionist movement, which will now create a civil war, and then South Africa just It's really unfortunate. I don't want this video to get longer than this, but I don't know. What do you guys think? I really hope it's a wake-up call to begin the search for really sustainable solutions for what we see going on in South Africa among the people groups. But share your thoughts. What do you think about this interview? Share your thoughts in the comments.